Thank you for your love, your constant support, and every generous donation that helps this mission grow. Your presence here means more than words can express. With gratitude and light. For centuries, certain teachings attributed to Jesus were removed from official Christianity. These teachings were not excluded due to historical error, but because they directly contradicted the religious control structure that became consolidated from the 4th century onwards. They claimed that human beings could access the divine directly, without intermediaries, mandatory rituals, or spiritual authorities. Among these teachings were explanations about phenomena that many people today experience but cannot understand or explain. One of these phenomena is ringing in the ears, a sound that appears with no apparent external cause and tends to intensify during moments of silence, introspection, personal or spiritual transition. The Gnostic texts, rediscovered in Egypt in 1945, and known as the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, present a different view from that which was institutionalized by the Church. According to these texts, Jesus taught that the true source of all existence does not communicate through words, but through frequency, vibration, and direct perception. This source was called the MONAD, not as a separate God, but as the original consciousness, the origin of everything that exists. The MONAD does not speak, does not command, does not threaten. It emits a constant signal, and only those whose inner structure is compatible with this signal are able to perceive it. Let us understand, based on these hidden teachings, why some people hear this ringing and others do not. It is not about disease, defect, or biological failure within this spiritual context. It is a sign of interaction between different levels of reality. Jesus did not teach this to the crowds. He taught it in reserved settings to those who demonstrated the capacity to understand beyond the literal interpretation. And this is the teaching that was hidden for more than 1,700 years and is now beginning to spontaneously reappear in the experiences of many people. I am George. Welcome to this channel that truly believes in a greater purpose. I already asked you to follow me and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. Now let's get to what matters. The real meaning of having ears to hear. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus repeatedly uses the expression, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." This phrase was never just a figure of speech. Within the spiritual tradition of the time, to hear meant to perceive something that did not come from the common physical senses. The Gnostic texts explain that Jesus made a clear distinction between levels of human consciousness. He observed that not all human beings were equally prepared to receive certain types of knowledge. This was not a moral division, but a functional one. According to these teachings, there were people completely identified with matter. They lived focused solely on survival, routine, status, and repetition. For them, any subtle signal went unnoticed because their attention was fully absorbed by the external world. There was a second group that perceived something beyond the material, but in an unstable way. These people had flashes of spirituality, moments of questioning, but were quickly reabsorbed by daily concerns. Their perception oscillated. And there was a third group called pneumatikoi, spiritual ones, in the texts. These people carried a different sensitivity. From an early age, they felt they didn't fully belong in the world as it operates. They questioned systems, hierarchies, imposed truths. They felt a void where others seemed satisfied. Jesus directed his deeper teachings to this third group, not because they were superior, but because they had the inner structure to sustain this type of knowledge without distorting it. Within this structure, divine communication did not occur through audible words. Contact happened through vibration. The monad does not send spoken messages. It emits a constant frequency. When this frequency finds resonance in someone, the body reacts. The ringing in the ears is described in these texts as one of the first physical effects of this resonance, not as something continuous for everyone, but as a signal that appears at specific moments, when a person's consciousness approaches alignment with the source. That's why Jesus said, not everyone had ears to hear. It was not about physical hearing, but about the inner capacity for perception. The sound didn't come from outside. It emerged from within, as a response to a subtle contact. The Church, by transforming spiritual teaching into doctrine and obedience, eliminated any possibility of direct interpretation. Anything that suggested communication without intermediaries was discarded. Hearing came to mean merely obeying, not perceiving. This is the foundation of the teaching that was hidden. The ringing is not something to be fought, but understood within a specific spiritual context. And this opens the path to understanding how the monad manifests in the experience of the chosen ones. What the monad is according to the hidden teachings. In the Gnostic teachings attributed to Jesus, the monad is presented as the absolute origin of all existence. It is not a god with a human form. It has no personality, emotions, or will in the human sense. The monad is pure consciousness, prior to any creation, prior to time, space, and matter. Everything that exists arises from it by emanation, not by creation in the usual sense. These texts make it clear that the monad does not govern the material world directly. It does not interfere in human daily life, does not punish, does not reward, and does not demand worship. Its presence manifests as a permanent, stable, and continuous field of consciousness. The communication of the monad does not occur through language, symbols, or commandments, but through frequency. This is a central difference between Gnostic teaching and institutional Christianity. While organized religion taught that God speaks through prophets, scriptures, and authorities, the Gnostics claimed that the source communicates directly with the divine spark present in the human being. This communication is silent, internal, and nonverbal. According to these teachings, every human being carries within themselves a spark of the monad. However, this spark may remain dormant or muffled by excessive identification with the material world. The more consciousness is fixed on fear, survival, status, competition, and constant distraction, the less this spark manifests. When, for some reason, the mind becomes silent, the spark begins to respond to the frequency of the source. This alignment does not happen suddenly and completely. It occurs in layers, in gradual approaches. The physical body, which also responds to frequencies, reacts to this process. It is at this point that the ringing in the ears appears in the Gnostic texts. It is not described as the message itself, but as a side effect of the approach between human consciousness and the frequency of the monad. The body, especially the nervous system, tries to adjust to a level of vibration that is not common in the usual state of consciousness. The Gnostics stated that the ear is one of the first points of perception of this frequency, because it is directly linked to balance, orientation, and environmental awareness. When the frequency of the monad passes through the filters of the rational mind, it generates an effect similar to an internal sound. It is not a physical sound, but a vibrational perception translated by the body. That's why the ringing has no external origin. It does not depend on the environment. It does not follow a predictable pattern, and it does not manifest the same way in all people. It appears at specific moments when the person is more receptive, less identified with the mental and emotional noise of daily life. The texts also explain why many people never experience this phenomenon, not because the monad does not transmit, but because their consciousness is constantly occupied. Repetitive thoughts, constant stimuli, worries, and distractions create a perceptual block. The frequency remains present, but finds no space to be perceived. Another important point is that the monad does not force contact. It does not invade human consciousness. The alignment happens through resonance, not imposition. When there is compatibility, the signal is perceived. When there isn't, it goes unnoticed. This view dismantles the idea that the ringing is a privilege or a punishment. Within this spiritual context, it is merely an indicator of momentary tuning. It does not make anyone superior, nor does it guarantee enlightenment. It simply signals that in that moment, there was an approach between individual consciousness and the source. Jesus, according to these teachings, made it clear that this process should neither be idolized nor feared. The focus was not on the phenomenon, but on the recognition of what it indicated. The sound was not the goal. The goal was the awakening of consciousness to its true origin. This understanding was considered dangerous because it took away from institutions the monopoly on spiritual experience. If the source communicates directly through frequency, there is no need for intermediaries. And that is precisely why this knowledge was hidden for centuries. The monad continues to transmit. The difference is that today, just as in the past, few know what they are perceiving when the signal appears. Why this knowledge was deliberately hidden. To understand why the teachings about the monad and the ringing in the ears were suppressed, it is necessary to understand the historical context of the formation of the institutional church. In the first centuries after the death of Jesus, Christianity was not a unified religion. There were several communities, each with different interpretations of who Jesus was and what he taught. Some of these communities followed a mystical and Gnostic line. For them, Jesus was a master who taught the awakening of consciousness and direct access to the divine source. Other communities began to structure Christianity as an organized religion, with hierarchy, rules, dogmas, and centralized authority. When Christianity came to be supported by the Roman Empire, especially from the 4th century onward, it became necessary to define a single doctrine. This unification was not spiritual, it was political. The goal was to create stability, social control, and uniformity of belief. Within this process, any teaching that threatened the authority of the institution needed to be eliminated. The Gnostic texts were especially dangerous because they claimed that human beings could access the divine without priests, temples, or mandatory rituals. This made the institution dispensable. The teaching that divine communication occurs through frequency and direct perception was a direct threat to religious power. If a person could recognize internal signs of contact with the source, such as ringing in the ears, they would not need the interpretation of others to validate their spiritual experience. For this reason, these texts were classified as heresy. They were burned, hidden, or buried. Their authors were persecuted, silenced, or killed. Direct knowledge was replaced by faith based on obedience and fear. Spiritual experience came to be mediated by dogmas. Hearing ceased to mean perceiving and came to mean obeying. Any internal manifestation that did not fit within doctrine was disqualified or associated with error, sin, or deception. Ringing in the ears, within this new model, had no space to be interpreted as a spiritual sign. It was ignored, ridiculed, or pathologized. What was once seen as an indicator of attunement came to be treated as something with no spiritual meaning. This erasure did not eliminate the phenomenon. It only removed the language to understand it. People continued to hear, but without reference, they began to feel fear or confusion. This is the direct result of the concealment of this knowledge. Generations of people disconnected from their own spiritual perception, dependent on external validation, and distanced from the direct experience of the source. The material world, systems of control, and constant distraction. The Gnostic texts describe the material world as an environment structured to keep human consciousness turned outward. They use the term archons to describe forces or systems that govern this structure. These archons should not necessarily be understood as physical entities, but as mechanisms of control that operate through the mind, emotions, and attention. According to these teachings, the main objective of these systems is to prevent inner silence. The less silence a person experiences, the less they perceive the frequency of the monad. The constant noise is not only external, but mental and emotional. Fear, anxiety, guilt, comparison, scarcity, and permanent distraction keep consciousness busy. When the mind is always reacting, it does not perceive. Ringing in the ears only becomes audible when there is a pause in this constant flow. The systems of control feed on dense emotional states. The more a person lives in alertness, conflict, and worry, the more trapped they become in the material world. This does not happen by chance. Modern society has intensified this model with an excess of stimuli, information, and pressure. The Gnostic texts affirm that silence is subversive. It breaks the cycle of automatic reaction. It is in silence that the frequency of the monad crosses the layers of distraction and becomes perceptible. That's why many people report ringing in the ears at night, when the external world slows down. It is not a coincidence. It is at this moment that the systems of control lose strength and internal perception opens up. When a person begins to perceive this signal, they naturally distance themselves from superficial patterns. This generates discomfort, both in the person and in the surrounding environment. The world reacts to the loss of control. The texts explain that this is an internal process, not an external fight. It is not about combating the material world, but about not being completely absorbed by it. The ringing is not an attack, nor a negative warning. It is an effect of the momentary alignment of consciousness with a frequency that is beyond the systems of control. It arises when attention returns inward. This understanding shows that the phenomenon is not isolated. It is directly linked to how consciousness moves within a world designed to distract it. When silence appears, the signal becomes audible. When the noise returns, it moves away. The frequency never disappears. It simply ceases to be perceived. The different manifestations of the ringing and what each one indicates. Within the Gnostic teachings attributed to Jesus, the ringing in the ears is not treated as a single, uniform phenomenon. It manifests in different ways, with distinct characteristics, and each of these manifestations indicates a specific type of interaction between human consciousness and the frequency of the monad. This differentiation is important because it prevents generic interpretations and helps to understand the process more objectively. The first manifestation described is the sudden and high-pitched ringing. It arises without warning, usually in only one ear, and can last from a few seconds to a few minutes. This type of signal is associated with moments when consciousness needs to be interrupted. According to the texts, it functions as an attention marker. Something in the person's mental state at that moment requires observation. It may be a recurring thought, an imminent decision, or an emotional pattern that is being reinforced without conscious awareness. The second manifestation is a more stable, continuous, and less aggressive ringing. This sound usually appears in moments of silence, meditation, prayer, or deep introspection. Unlike the first, it does not interrupt, but accompanies. It indicates temporary alignment. In this state, consciousness is less reactive and more receptive. The signal does not draw attention to something external, but confirms that there is attunement in that moment. The third manifestation does not appear exactly as a sound, but as a sensation of pressure in the ears, forehead, or top of the head. This type of experience is related to the internal reorganization of perception. The text described this stage as activation. Something that was latent begins to manifest more clearly. It is not a matter of immediate mystical evolution, but of a gradual adjustment of the perceptive system. These manifestations do not follow a fixed order and do not happen in the same way for everyone. They depend on the person's internal state, the level of mental silence, and the willingness to perceive without resistance. The most common mistake is to try to classify these experiences as good or bad. How the chosen one should relate to the signal. According to the Gnostic teachings, the way a person reacts to the ringing is more important than the ringing itself. The signal was not described as something to be fought, ignored, or interpreted obsessively. It was described as something to be recognized with neutrality and conscious attention. The first common mistake is trying to forcibly silence the ringing. This creates tension, fear, and resistance. Resistance generates more mental noise, which further distances the person from a clear perception of the signal. The second mistake is trying to turn the phenomenon into identity, believing it defines who the person is. This also distorts the process. The central guidance of the texts is simple. Observe without judgment. When the ringing arises, the person should simply acknowledge its presence and note the internal state of that moment. There is no need to ask questions, seek immediate answers, or assign grand meanings. Conscious attention organizes perception. When the person observes the signal without fear and without expectation, what once seemed like noise begins to become clearer. The experience stabilizes. The body adjusts to the perceived frequency. Internal resistance, confirmation, and stabilization of the process. The Gnostic texts affirm that when a person begins to recognize the signal and relate to it consciously, a predictable phenomenon arises: internal resistance. This resistance does not come from the outside, but from the conditioned mind itself. Thoughts of doubt appear. Questions arise, saying that none of this makes sense, that it is imagination or irrelevant. These thoughts are not considered failures in the process. On the contrary, they are described as signs that something is being reorganized internally. The rational mind has been trained to control, classify, and explain everything. When it encounters something it cannot dominate, it tries to re-establish control. This manifests as denial, distraction, or sudden disinterest. The texts advise that this resistance should not be fought. Fighting the thoughts only reinforces the internal conflict. The indicated posture is to observe the resistance in the same way as one observes the ringing, with neutrality. Another important point is that the process is not linear. There are periods of greater perception and periods of silence. Ringing in the ears, within the hidden teachings attributed to Jesus, was never presented as a bodily error, a nervous system malfunction, or a sign of something negative. It was described as a perceptual effect that arises when human consciousness comes into contact, even momentarily, with the frequency of the monad. This understanding completely changes how this phenomenon is interpreted. For centuries, this knowledge was removed from the spiritual field accessible to ordinary people. Institutional religion replaced direct experience with doctrine, perception with obedience, and inner silence with external rituals. As a result, internal phenomena ceased to be understood and began to be ignored, devalued, or treated as problems to be fixed. What the Gnostic texts reveal is simple and direct. The source of existence does not communicate through words. It manifests through frequency. This frequency is always present, but it is only perceived when there is enough internal space for it. The ringing in the ears arises as one of the first signs of this perception, not as a final goal. but as an indicator of attunement. This signal does not define anyone as special, superior, or enlightened. It does not guarantee awakening, it does not replace personal responsibility, and it does not exempt anyone from the difficulties of human life. It only indicates that at that moment, there was alignment between individual consciousness and a deeper layer of reality. Understanding this prevents two common extremes: fear and idealization. Fear arises when a person has no reference to interpret what they are experiencing. Idealization arises when the phenomenon is turned into identity. Both distort the process. The path presented by the teachings attributed to Jesus is that of conscious observation, without attachment and without resistance. The most important thing, according to these teachings, is not the phenomenon itself, but the effect it produces on how the person relates to their own consciousness. When there is recognition, the person becomes less reactive, less conditioned by fear, and more centered. This is reflected in more conscious choices, clearer relationships, and greater inner autonomy. The knowledge that was hidden does not return to create new beliefs, but to restore a forgotten understanding that spiritual experience is direct, internal, and does not depend on external validation. The ringing in the ears was just one of the signs used to point to this truth. By understanding this, the phenomenon ceases to be a problem to be eliminated and becomes an indicator of perception. The sound does not call outward, it points inward. And in recognizing this, the person does not find ready-made answers, but enough clarity to continue their own path with more awareness and less noise. Comment.